night started. So I guess I should wish everyone a good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from today. Thank you again for attending our 2025 Indigo Talk. As some of you know, this is our one virtual program each year, so we always look forward to the opportunity to be with our friends from all around the world. I know it's early in the morning for some folks and maybe late at night for others. And so we truly appreciate being able to share this time together. My name is Lillian Koizumi, and I am the Senior Program Manager here at the Ikeda Center, and I will be your moderator today. So before we jump into our program, I thought I could share a little bit about the Ikeda Center and our Indigo Talks series for those who are joining us for the first time. Our center was established in 1993 by Daisaku Ikeda, who was a Buddhist philosopher, peace builder, educator, author, and poet. Mr. Ikeda was just a teenager when Japan entered World War II, and he experienced firsthand the sufferings and tragedies of war, including losing his own brother. Based on those experiences and his practice of Nichiren Buddhism, he dedicated his entire life to fostering a culture of peace through dialogue. He is the founder of several institutions promoting peace, culture, and education, including our center here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he championed the power of dialogue as a central means to addressing global and social challenges. His commitment to dialogue as the surest path to peace inspires and informs all of our programs and publications. You can read more about our work on our website, which we'll post in the chat now. Indigo Talks was launched in 2021 and named after the Buddhist expression from the indigo and even deeper blue. This lecture series features renowned scholars in dialogue with enduring works by Mr. Ikeda. Just as items repeatedly dyed with indigo turn bluer than the indigo itself, the Chinese allegory of the indigo plant exemplifies the impact learning has on deepening one's wisdom, courage, and compassion. Today's talk is the sixth one in the series, and we're so incredibly grateful and honored to have Dr. Darren Kew as our 2025 Indigo Talk speaker. Dr. Kew is Dean of the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego, where he is also a professor. He studies the relationship between conflict resolution methods, particularly interfaith and interethnic peace building, and democratic development in Africa, Northern Ireland, and the United States. Much of his work focuses on the role of civil society groups in this development. He has also been a consultant on peace and democracy initiatives to the United Nations, USAID, US Institute of Peace, and the US State Department, and to a number of NGOs, including the Carter Center. He monitored the last 7 Nigerian elections and the 2007 elections in Sierra Leone, and from 2023 to 2024, he co-facilitated a working group of religious leaders focusing on religion and peace building in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Professor Kew was asked by the British and American governments to join an influential international commission requested by the Nigerian government in 2010, which contributed to a major overhaul of its election system. He is author of numerous works on Nigerian politics and conflict resolution, including the book Civil Society, Conflict Resolution, and Democracy in Nigeria, and his articles have appeared in International Negotiation, the Journal of Democracy, and Current History, among others. We'll also put a link in the chat so you can learn more about Dr. Kew's important and inspiring work. Me and my colleagues here at the center have had the pleasure of getting to know and learn from Dr. Kew over the years, actually starting from when he was a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where he served as the chair of the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance, as well as the executive director of the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development. As you can imagine, based on everything I just shared, Dr. Kew is one of the busiest people that I know. But what really has struck me in our interactions is how present and genuine he is when he shares space with you, from which you can really feel his commitment to and belief in dialogue. Dr. Kew's timely talk today is titled Reflections on Religion and Peacebuilding. In this current moment, when religion is often used as a means to divide us, we're really looking forward to learning from Dr. Kew how faith can actually bring us together. After his talk, we will have time for Q&A, so please feel free at any time to submit your questions in the Q&A box below, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. And so now, without further delay, I'd like to turn the Zoom stage over to Dr. Kew.
Okay, Lillian, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you great and see you great too.
Well, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. And I'm really grateful to the Ikeda Center for inviting me to join you all this evening, this morning, depending where you are on the planet. It's wonderful that folks from all over are joining. This is an incredible opportunity. I was going to say I really wish we were all in the same room, but in some ways I wouldn't be able to have all of you together. So thank you for joining us. I was privileged to have connected to the Ikeda Center when it started back in '93, when Ginny got it started. So I've been a fan of the work of the Ikeda Center for a long time. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity. And as Lillian said, I mean, I think, so often when we think about religion, the next word that comes in the sentence is often conflict or warfare or something like that. Particularly in our studies in conflict resolution, peace building, we're so easily drawn into conversations about religion and conflict, and that's certainly no surprise. Religion falls into this broad category that those of us in the field often talk about as, a value-based conflict. So it's different than, say, if we're fighting over money, I want 100 and you want $50, we can compromise at 75. When it comes to value-based conflicts, there's often not much room for compromise. It's hard to compromise your values. It's hard to move on those. And our identities are often built around that, which makes it even more complicated. And religion itself is even more complicated than the typical value conflict, because by definition, religions typically have bureaucracies connected to them, right? Religious institutions, which means that we don't have individual control over what the religion says. If you're a Christian or a Catholic or a Protestant or a particular Buddhist or Hindu group or so on, if you're a Muslim, you yourself don't get to decide what the religion says. You're part of a much broader group. And so there's a lot that's out of your control as much as is in your control. So religion, of course, it's understandable that it's connected to conflict in many, many ways. But what we forget is that more often than not, much of the peace building around the world is done by religious affiliated actors on a daily basis. And I'm including clerics in that bunch, but also lay affiliated people in the name of religion or through religious institutions or motivated by religious values. Folks on a daily basis are trying to do good in the world through this, and in particular, trying to broker peace. And it's that side of the ledger I want to talk about this evening or this morning, depending on where you are, because that's been where much of my research in recent years has gone, and certainly a lot of my practice has been to work with and talk to religious leaders engaged in peace building work, particularly in Nigeria, over much of my lifetime. In the last 5 years, I've been moonlighting in Northern Ireland, where I've been trying to do some research there. And then, of course, here where I am in the United States as well has been informed by much of this. So I'm going to share some of my learning in this in recent years, but I want to start off with a couple of caveats. First is to note that I am not a scholar of religion or theology. So although I have been working with, imams and pastors and other folks over the years, and they've taught me a lot about the various religions and the beliefs that they're engaged in, but I myself am not a scholar of religion. So I don't claim that same sort of depth of understanding about religion as a theologian or a religious study have. I'm a conflict resolution person, I'm a peace building person. So that's the lens through which that I think about these things. I also want to underscore about that 5 year dimension with Northern Ireland to say that I do not claim to have the depth of understanding about Northern Ireland that I do say about Nigeria or about the United States. So I want to say that from the beginning. I'm also going to say that, it looks like we've got 115 participants out there. So I've structured my remarks for an outsider's audience, in the sense that I'm not expecting that any or all of you are conflict resolution, peace building jockeys like me, or academics as well. But if there are those of you out there that are in those same tribes as me, for the question and answer, I'll be very happy to sort of go into methodology, to go into sort of deeper questions, depending upon what direction you want it to get. I am going to share my screen with you now. So I've got a few slides I want to share with you, and then we can go into that. All right, here. Okay, Lillian, can you just pop back in? Just tell me no. Can everybody see this fine?
It looks great, Darren. Thank you.
This photo, it's very pixelated. Actually, is an amazing photo from Kano. They were in 2012. That's why it's a pixelated photo. But back in 2012.
Darren, actually, we just got a few comments. I think maybe if there's something blocking your microphone, I think your voice is coming in a little bit choppy.
Okay, I've got a piece of paper I've been holding here.
That must have been.
Does this sound better?
Much better.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks for that. So I didn't realize, I don't know where my microphone is here on my laptop, so it must be right wherever I had my paper. Thank you for that. And two, if I speak too fast or if I don't speak clearly, please anyone let me know, and I'll be on the lookout for that. So just this photo is just to say is a wonderful example of interfaith peace building. This was during a period of there were protests going on against the Nigerian government at that time in 2012, and it came time for prayer time. And this was during a period where there was also, and there still is, an insurgency in Nigeria called Boko Haram, and there were fears of attacks on these protests. And what this picture shows is while the Muslims were praying, you see in the background a circle of Christians arm in arm circled around them to protect them while they are praying. And I draw so much inspiration from this, just to show how much this, interreligious peace building, just the tremendous impacts that it can have. But the motivation for me in this is, as somebody who is, I'm not a priest or a cleric in that sense, though I'm certainly a very spiritual person on my own. But in the peace building work that I do over the years, I noticed in working with my colleagues that I'll talk about in a second, that religious-based peace builders, particularly religious leaders, have a series of tools that secular peace builders like myself don't have. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So if you are a priest, or if you're an imam, or you're a cleric in some way, if you're a monk, a nun, etc., you have access to certain tools that those of us that are not religiously affiliated in that way do not bring. And so I wanted to find out more about, okay, is there something different that religious peacemakers have that those of us who are not clerics and so on don't have? And indeed, you're not surprised, and this is obvious, that they do have additional tools available with them. But a critical and important caveat of this that I'm going to talk about is that they have these tools, particularly when they're working with religious populations that secular folks don't often have. And so the level of how religious the group is that you're working with has an impact on how effective these tools that religious peacemakers are. And I'll explain that in more detail as we go along. But what interests me so much about it is that religious peacemakers do indeed appear to have this ability to help participants in peace processes leapfrog over key emotional blocks, particularly sort of grievances, deeply held grievances, that those of us who are secular, it often takes a lot longer for us to get participants to get there. Oftentimes, religious-based peace builders can get people down to the deepest level of grievances and to the possibility of forgiveness. And in many ways, forgiveness is, to some extent, if I can use this term, sort of the holy grail of peace building in general is that, you can get people to come to sort of a ceasefire, you can get them to sort of come to, a basic agreement about a solution to a deal, but getting them to get to these sort of deeper transformative needs of forgiveness and healing takes a much longer time typically for someone like me to get a working group towards. But religious-based folks can often get folks there, oftentimes in one session, which in our field, if you're not in it, let me just say, is lightning speed to talk about forgiveness and healing. So I'm going to review a little bit the cases of a Nigerian NGO that I worked with, the Interfaith Mediation Center, but also some work I've been doing more recently in Northern Ireland with religious peace builders there that have some interesting findings in this regard that I want to tell you about. Let me just sort of talk about Nigeria really quickly. I mean, this is obviously a whole conversation or lecture upon lecture in itself. I think the key thing just to take from this map is about Nigeria is that it's extremely ethnically complex, but through a religious lens, Nigeria is 50-50 Muslim Christian. And you see that line going right down from the top right down to the bottom left. Essentially, even though there's no neat line sort of dividing Nigeria 50-50 like that, but generally speaking, north of that line is heavily Muslim and south of that line is more heavily Christian. And so the communities that live sort of along the fault line areas there are often sort of deeply divided religiously. And you see where I put the little smiley face is roughly where the city of Kaduna in the state of Kaduna in Nigeria is located. So it's right along that fault line. A river goes right through the middle of Kaduna, and north of the river is generally Muslim, and south of the river is generally Christian. So this is where my friends, the Interfaith Mediation Center, work. And where much of the sort of research and work that I've done over the last sort of 20 years has been based in this area. I just want to say before I move on, when I talk about Islam and Christianity in Nigeria, I want to point out that within Islam, you have a host of different subdivisions, different Sufi orders, Wahhabist groups called the Isala and others. There's a Shiite movement in Nigeria. When we talk about Christians, you have Catholics, Anglicans, Methodists, Pentecostals, so there are many different churches. And then there are also traditional religions in Nigeria, traditional African religions, and practitioners of these as well, which may overlap with Christianity and Islam. But just to say that, this is neither side is monolithic, and this will be important when we talk about peace building. Northern Ireland as well is roughly 50-50 Protestant Catholic. And much of the sort of the dynamic there of this sort of 50-50 dynamic is important from a conflict resolution perspective, because when you have that kind of 50-50 dynamic, it tends to create a zero-sum game that we call where, one side's gain is seen as another side's loss. And when you have that kind of psychological perspective of zero sum, it makes compromise extremely difficult. So that sort of value-based conflict dimension I was talking about early on becomes even more problematic when everybody's seeing things through that lens, right? And so you get into this dynamic in Kaduna of, right, okay, how many in the state government, how many ministers or commissioners in the state government, are Muslim? How many are Christian? In Northern Ireland, right? So how many bureaucrats, are Catholic, and how many are Protestant? How many jobs are Catholics getting in government as opposed to Protestants, and so on and so forth. So think about that dynamic. And those of you who are looking at this from the United States, think about this in terms of a red-blue dynamic, right? That's happening in the United States increasingly, right? Left-right divides. Are you one side or the other? Which often have religious dimensions to them as well. So keep that in mind as we're going forward. So these are my friends. They go by the pastor and the imam, or the imam and the pastor. Pastor James Wuye and Imam Muhammad Ashafa. These two individuals in the 1990s were, by anyone's definition of a fundamentalist, both deeply fundamentalist Christian, fundamentalist Muslim. They were sworn enemies that tried to kill each other on multiple occasions. You can't see well in that picture, but you can kind of tell the pastor lost his arm, his right arm, in one battle to a blow, and has a prosthetic arm there. The imam lost his beloved teacher and a family member in another battle. The two of these men later reconciled and formed a peace NGO to do Muslim-Christian dialogue. And I worked with them for many, many years, trying to improve their capacity in terms of the impact and reach of the work that they did, and to learn from them from the excellent work that they did. And much of what you're about to hear is sort of very much influenced by that learning. Central to what they do in their methodology, and I'll talk more about this in a second, is telling the story of the path that they themselves walked. How they tried to kill each other, what led them both to ultimately forgiving and wanting to work with one another over time, and how that path was an ongoing one. Forgiveness is never just a momentary blip where you suddenly do it. Oftentimes you have relapses and you have to go back and sort of try to work through those issues again and again. So they tell their story in ways that are important, and this is an important part of what they do. But what is so important to this is, and storytelling is something that all peace builders do, and all of our methodologies in some way typically involve some sort of storytelling. So that in itself doesn't make them special as a peace builder. But what it does, the type of story that they tell is something different, and the religious dimension of the story that they tell is something that I'll want to talk about in a second. Let me just see. I have a hand raised, I see. Lillian, do you want me to take that now, or should I keep going?
I think we can take it during Q&A. Yeah, so if Jackie, if you can hang tight, we'll come back to you.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Sure. And Lillian, if you can sort of give me a 10 minutes heads up, I forgot to ask you, that would be great. Thank you. Okay. So this is sort of the general contours of the approach that I would say many of the religious peace builders that I've worked with around the world take, and this is extremely generic. We can any actual peace builder watching this now would say, well, I don't quite do it that way. I do it this way. I do it that way. So this is my vanilla template for us, just to sort of start this conversation. For those of you that aren't in the field, to just get a general sense. And these contours would be very recognizable to any secular peace builder as well. I think anybody would say, yeah, I kind of do this in some way as well. But let me start with this sort of the step one that you'll find before a religious peace builder would do an intervention, is there is this sort of inner preparation and transformation dimension that is extremely important. And again, many secular peace builders will talk about, actually, I have to do a lot of this as well in terms of reflection and so on. But I think religious peace builders put a real premium on this stage of the process. And I want to talk a bit more about particular aspects of it in a second. But what makes a religious peace builder different is that religions, by definition, have entire systems about inner preparation and transformation, typically through vehicles we would recognize as prayer, meditation, but there are also a lot of rituals here where religious practitioners have to start with some kind of return to the source, God, a deity in some fashion, depending upon the religion that you're talking about. There's typically a dimension of connecting back to this central spiritual source. Often, the word God is used, but many practitioners go in a lot of different directions, and you'll find that even secular folks that do this stuff utilize some sort of practice that a religion often has launched or given to the rest of the world in terms of, say, a meditation practice, a prayer practice, and so on. So this inner dimension, this inner journey is something that is a critical piece of this, that the religious practitioner stresses and will refer to on a regular basis in the work that they do. And so the contours of this is something I'd like to talk about in greater depth as we move along. The second step is they will set up their peace team that's going to do the intervention. The key point I only want to talk about here is that, and this is something secular folks do as well, is that your peace intervention team typically needs to involve members of both communities. So there'll be a Muslim and a Christian in an interfaith intervention in Nigeria. There'll be a Protestant and a Catholic in Northern Ireland, and so on, right? Is that you want your peace team to reflect all of the sort of colors of the rainbow that are involved in the conflict in question. Then there'll be a preparation phase for larger outreach. I'm not going to talk much about that, but that is something we can discuss in question and answer if you like. And then there are the actual workshops themselves and the meetings, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then lastly, there will be a follow-up effort to try to change the systems of the conflict based on the workshop. And this is often determined by the workshop itself, an effort to sort of scale up the impact. And I'll say more about steps 4 and 5 in just a moment. Let's talk about that workshop model. And both of these pictures feature me centrally only because these were just two pictures I had available of what sort of a typical workshop looks like. I am by no means central in these interventions. I'm usually playing a supporting role. You can see on the left where the pastor and the imam are seated and really leading a workshop like this. But a workshop is nothing more than bringing together, 10 to 15 of members of both communities that are in conflict in some way. And typically the way sort of the strategy will work that Pastor James and Imam Ashafa will use, and many other sort of religious peace builders that I've worked with take the same approach, is that the first thing you do is you reach out to other clerics like yourself. So you go to the affected communities that may have had violence take place, and you'll talk to the imams and the pastors and the priests, and you will work with them, and you will bring them together for a workshop themselves in order to try to get them to talk about the state of the conflict issues in their communities, to help transform them essentially into a contact group, which will then itself hold workshops in the affected communities that have been hit by violence. And so here you see an example of that, where various religious practitioners themselves are brought together, religious leaders, for workshops where you take them through the issues at stake in the conflict, and you're trying to build a new relationship with them. And those of you in the field, will recognize sort of basic sort of Herb Kelman style workshop approaches based on contact theory, which, if we do have any folks that are deep in the weeds on that, I'm happy to talk more about what that looks like in the question and answer. But here's where I get into sort of central to these sorts of workshops is where, and particularly early on in the workshop, is where the pastor and the imam and other sort of similar religious peace builders like this will often sort of tell their story of reconciliation and forgiveness. And central to both of their stories is the religious journey that they walked on. And, Pastor James, for instance, will talk about how in his journey, there was a moment where he himself was in church, and he was in the audience, in the congregation at that point, in that particular moment, and the pastor then was sort of giving his homily, and was talking about the importance of forgiveness, and how Jesus puts such a premium on turning the other cheek and forgiving one's enemies, and how one cannot be a good Christian with hatred in your heart. And the pastor talked about how he felt like, even though the preacher was not preaching to him directly, he felt like he was being singled out and how he even sort of, ducked down behind the pew and was sort of hiding from the pastor. But the more that the preacher spoke, the more he felt like he was that a spotlight from God was being sort of put on him and being told, look, you cannot go on the way you've gone on with hate in your heart, and that you must reach out. The Imam talks about a similar path that he walked through prayer and meditation, and how the more that he studied the Quran, and of course, those of you who know Islam, one translation of the word Islam itself has to do with peace. That, central to Islam is peace and mercy and forgiveness, and how the more he studied, the more he felt like he could not go on as he was in terms of the violence that he had espoused, and how this led the two of them eventually to reconcile. There were other dimensions of the story that they tell, but telling this story is so, so important. And religious peace practitioners often tell that story in some way, shape, or form of how through their religious journey, the more they reflected upon the basic tenets of their spirituality, led them to seeing that, look, I have to reach out across this divide, and that this piece of it becomes an important part of their modeling in the process that they espouse. And so they move from sort of storytelling to actually sort of appeals to religious beliefs. And here I'm going to start underscoring. Imagine how important it is, if you are a religious-based practitioner, to be working with a crowd that actually believes in the religion. So when we talk about some of the sort of questions of transferability of some of this learning, to say those of you that want to be peace builders but maybe are not a cleric or a monk or something along those lines, we have to ask, okay, how transferable is this stuff? But for religious populations that they're doing this, the appeal that they make to religious beliefs is very important. And Pastor James and Imam and Ashraf often talk about, they call it divine intimidation, where they sort of, I've almost seen them sort of put people a bit in a headlock, although they don't do a headlock, but pretty close to sort of saying, Jesus says, you must turn the other cheek. What do you think about that? How can you be a good Christian if you're not reflecting on that? Think about what that means. They lay a heavy on you, a bit of fire and brimstone, and sort of pulling that to say, look, you must get to, for Christians, you have to have a come to Jesus moment. For Muslims, you have to think more about what is laid out. What has God laid out in the Holy Quran for you? What does it say? What do the practices of the Holy Prophet mean for you? And so on, right? So that kind of spiritual leverage is an essential part of the process. But second, there's an important dimension to this in religious populations, and in particular in status conscious populations like Nigeria, that their status is really, really important in the leverage that they have, right? So Nigeria is a place where if you are a cleric, you are held in high esteem in society. You have a certain place in society. So it's a mix of the actual content of the religion itself, but it's also a dimension of the status of these religious-based practitioners that is really, really important for moving individuals down this path. As part of the workshop as well, and this is something we can talk about in question and answer, and I want to just say a little bit more in a bit, is that part of these workshops, in addition to sort of divine intimidation appeals, in addition to the status that they have, is that in all of these kinds of workshops, very commonly you see all around the world, religious-based practitioners will talk about religion itself and will work a conversation about religion into the workshop. So they will talk about, for instance, each other's sacred text. So Muslims and Christians will read the Holy Quran, read the Holy Bible, and there will be conversations about that in the context of the workshop, which is not simply informational, though that is important in itself, but it's meant to challenge preconceptions and stereotypes that they have of each other. And what's so interesting about the dynamic that this happens in the workshop is you will see the Muslims disagreeing a bit about what Islam says and what the Prophet means and so on. You'll see the Christians disagreeing about what Jesus said and, well, what does this mean? And so as the Christians are disagreeing and sort of, talking about this with themselves, and the Muslims are, doing this, the other side is watching. And they see that there's a debate about these things, just like they debate with their own people. So what this does is it muddies the waters. And why that is so important from a peace building perspective is that when people have absolute certainty about their convictions, absolute certainty about the history that has happened between them, it leaves very little room for negotiation. And the more that you can sort of muddy these waters a little bit, and the more you can see that even the sacred has differences of opinion, that it's not as black and white, it's not as zero sum, remember that word, as we thought it was. The more you can sort of muddy these waters, the more you can get people to have a sense of alternatives and movement, and where we can try to work out some kind of a system of understanding and a solution to our problems, that we're able to move forward with. And so consequently, this leads to a greater possibility. And I mentioned the sort of happening in the context of these narratives of forgiveness, that the pastor and the imam and others like them model, that offers an opportunity for this kind of release, and ultimately even an apology. Apologies are something that, as secular peace builders, we talk about. You cannot ask someone to apologize. You really have to get, it has to come from the person itself. And religious-based peace builders do not like force an apology from one side or the other. But this conversation about forgiveness, and this conversation about spirituality, the conversation about, you and your enemy are one. You are all parts of the body of Christ, or all parts of God's creation. And so therefore all being sacred, and therefore, must connect in some way, leads to a quicker conversation about these things and a quicker realization on participants than often a secular peace builder like me, like myself, can get to. Because they are clerics, and think about, again, the strategy I mentioned where you're involving local clerics in the process, you often can get reinforcement after the workshop. So those of you who are in the peace building field often know, when we talk about doing these kinds of mediations, workshops, that kind of thing, facilitations, within the facilitation itself, I can often get people to find each other. But getting them to follow up afterwards is extremely difficult. When you have religious practitioners involved, they're often, they are meeting with their congregations on a regular basis. They are preaching from the pulpit on Friday or on Sunday, about the importance of forgiveness. So there's follow-up. There's a system to follow up this work. And of course, the religious dimension has a strong motivational component to it. I mentioned this sort of sacred text approach. This might be something you might want to talk about in question and answer later. It's really, really fascinating to see. These are just an example of two quotes, one from the New Testament and the Christian Bible, one from the Quran, that the imam and the pastor often use. We have a manual that we put together that is full of this kind of stuff. I'd be very happy to share with you, any of you, if you're interested, that sort of goes through the methodology and talks about, how they do what they do. And you'll find quotes like this, where they will often try to steer both sides to themes that you find in the sacred text, talking about the importance of bridging divides, the importance of forgiveness, the importance of understanding, and so on. But the sacred text approach is only one great approach that you find all around the world. Prayer sessions are often a common thing you see as well. There are lots of different rituals you'll see. So there's lots of that kind of stuff we can talk about. So here's that leapfrog effect that I mentioned earlier on. Now, let me just say sort of a little bit more about what it does. Is that you see, because of this, the dimensions of the spiritual sort of the religious peace builders have access to, it's clearly has this sort of quicker internal change that is apparent when participants come out of these sorts of workshops and beyond. And if you're interested, I can show you some of the data that we have later for some of you that are data jockeys like me. Happy to share it with you, or I can give you some of the reports that we have if that's of interest. Just let me know. But this ability to sort of leap over these emotional blocks and grievances that those of us who are secular practitioners often it takes multiple sessions on our part and constant sort of engagement with them that we can take years for someone like me. That religious-based practitioners can often get folks in the first session to really sort of to circumvent those long periods and to get over those emotional blocks in ways that are just dramatic and really fascinating. The narratives that they tell, these sort of religious narratives that they tell, also sort of model the change that participants are having to do. So it's often like the pastor and imam talk about the long road that they've been down, and it allows many participants to not have to walk down that long road. They can almost say, look, we've done this for you. You can see what we've done. You don't have to wait as long as we did. So these narratives are really powerful in this way. And because of that, as I say, it tends to lead towards forgiveness of these sorts of grievances. And how does it do that? Is that on the one hand, there's the pressure that these religious beliefs and status together, sort of provide. So the imam told me so. The imam told me I have to forgive. The pastor said I got to do this, so I got to do it because the imam said so. This is an important religious figure in my life. I need to listen to what they're saying. But also, too, because of that status, and this is very, very important, I think, is that religious figures often can give permission to forgive. It reminds me of, I remember the first time I was in Northern Ireland, it was during the tail end of the Troubles period, which was the sort of Civil War conflict in the early 90s time when I was there. And I remember talking to at that point, this was a Protestant friend, and he was talking about how, he could be sitting at a pub and talking to a Catholic, but they don't know that they're Protestant and Catholic. And, and then suddenly the issue of sort of what neighborhood you live in would come up. And then based on neighborhood, because it's a highly segregated society, people know, oh, okay, you're from there, you must be Catholic, you must be Protestant. I cannot be seen as talking to you. I may want to reach across the divide, but I can't be seen in front of my friends talking to somebody from the other side. Religious figures, when they say you must do this, it kind of provides a social permission, a get out of jail card, an excuse to forgive, a social excuse, this kind of social permission, which can be extremely, extremely helpful. So that dimension is really important that comes through this sort of both the religion and the status factor. I want to point out the therapeutic dimension of religious-based peace building, but to note it's not therapy, right? So any therapist in the audience is going to say, hey, this isn't therapy. There's some important dimensions to it that are not therapeutic, that are not straight out of the therapy handbook, but it can be healing in a way. And oftentimes, where the imam and pastor are working in Nigeria, and I would say in some parts in Northern Ireland, though Northern Ireland, there's a much better sort of therapy network available to you. Oftentimes, folks don't have access to that or are not willing to go. And the religious peace practitioner is the best therapeutic experience they're going to get. And so that sort of dimension is very important. Religious leaders are often able to get people to the table to come into these workshops. It can take someone like me many years before I can get people in to build those relationships. Religious-based peace practitioners can often get people right in very well. I talked about the sort of reinforcement upon reentry back into society after a workshop is over that religious-based practitioners have. and how religion has this ability to sort of provoke openness to behavior change and acceptance of the other in a way that a secular person often, doesn't have that same ability. Um, hold on here. I want to talk now briefly just about one other dimension, this sort of internal dimension that I talked about. And this is where lately my research has been talking to a lot of religious-based peace practitioners in Northern Ireland. And here again, I want to stress that I am not by any means sort of a deep scholar on Northern Ireland politics or religion. I want to give a shout out to one of my mentors, Professor Gladys Gagniel. And here's a book she did on one such religious peace practitioner, Father Jerry Reynolds. There are many, many folks like Father Reynolds who reached across the religious divide during this Troubles period that I mentioned. And Gladys's book talks, and many other scholars talk about, this importance of what I call sort of this transformative experience that religious-based peace practitioners themselves go through and try to model for participants in their workshops and in their peace practices. That in particular, in terms of a lot of the stuff I've just talked about, I think in recent years I've really centered in on this point, especially that is so different about religious-based peace practice than say those of us who are secular folks that we have to reflect on and think about. Is in general, when you think about if you live in a divided society, particularly in a civil war society, the rational actor model from economics and political science says that each of us as individuals typically make decisions based on a cost benefits calculus, right? You make the choice that you choose the alternative that brings the most benefit to you at the least cost, right? And anybody in their right mind in a civil war scenario, when they make a cost benefit analysis of reaching across the conflict divide, that cost benefit says, okay, the cost of talking to somebody from that other community that we're at war with versus the benefits, tell me don't do it, right? It tells me stay home. Because the costs just are too costly, right? I could lose my life. In Northern Ireland, I could get a bullet put through my knee during the Troubles if I'm seen as reaching across that divide. I'm a traitor, right? In the United States, it's getting more and more difficult in some circumstances to reach across those divides. So that cost benefit calculus says stay home, right? Don't reach across the divide. What leads someone to be willing to do that? And oftentimes, when you talk to these religious-based peace practitioners, they talk about how through some sort of prayer activity on their part, meditation, but sometimes, like the pastor, like I mentioned, they have this sort of road to Damascus moment where they feel that God or the other side is talking to them directly and breaks through. And here's where Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, I'm looking forward to my colleagues from the Ikeda Center can talk about. Dr. Ikeda, I know, has talked about this as well. The importance of this kind of transformative experience, the transformative moment, right? Something that has lifted you up outside of yourself, connected to something more, to God, to the universe, to humanity in some way. And the critical dimension of this is once you've been through this transformative experience, however it happens, suddenly this cost benefit analysis that I've talked about shifts. Suddenly, it's not that you value your life any less. In some ways, you value it all the more. But in many ways, where you view your life in the bigger picture changes, right? Suddenly, how you view your community, humanity, all of these sorts of things changes. And there's a bigger calculus that you're engaged in. And your own life suddenly becomes, smaller in this kind of bigger picture. And that the risk of reaching across the divide becomes less than the benefit that you see, right? And so this experience is central to sort of the religious peace practitioner's effort. But the question I want to leave you with as we're talking about this is a question of engineering, right? So as a peace practitioner, how do we engineer an out-of-body experience among our clients when we're working in a workshop, right? How do you try to do this? And in the processes that I've seen, right, part of it is this mix of storytelling, but also through experiencing the other in this kind of facilitated environment. There are different ways that practitioners try to provoke this experience. And I can go into greater detail into that in question and answer if you're interested to it. But it's so interesting to me is there are many different ways. I've come down to their sort of different buckets that religious peace practitioners try to use in order to do that. And you won't be surprised by any of them. Many of them circle around the path that they themselves took, which is through prayer and meditation, right? So a workshop will often involve some sort of prayer experience, some sort of meditative experience to try to get people to have that kind of out-of-body experience themselves. Followed by the narratives of hearing the narratives of the pastor and the imam, but then getting participants themselves to share their narratives, but to trying to gear those conversations toward a transformative experience, to try to remind people, when did you feel closest to God? Talk about that. When did you have an experience that was beyond? What was that like? What is the relevance of that to the work we're trying to do today in terms of bridging across those divides? So there's several buckets in those areas that talk about that, but it's still a really, really interesting question that I'm still struggling with, right? As someone like me trying to have these kinds of workshops, how do you engineer the out-of-body experience? How do you engineer the road to Damascus in a workshop? Beyond what I've just talked about today. Concerns I want to finish with, and I'll reiterate the question I posed for you much earlier in this conversation, right? Of how transferable is this stuff? If you live in a very secular American suburb, can you do something like the pastor and imam in this? If you haven't tried to kill somebody from the other religion and haven't been maimed by the other side, can you still tell your story and use this sort of same methodology in a more secular society? This is something that the Northern Irish peace builders really struggle with. Northern Ireland in the last 50 years, much like the United States, has become an increasingly secular society. Religious-based peace practitioners do not have the same status that they once had 50 years ago in the community. Who else could do this? So in an American context, is this something that, for instance, like a high school football coach could do in a community? Do they have that same kind of status? Do they have that same kind of spiritual custodianship that religious peace practitioners have? What could you do in terms of your status in society? So this transferability question is an interesting one for us that we could talk about more if you're interested. There's a very important health question on this. I want to go back to that point about this stuff is not therapy, right? Is that, the pastor and the imam are not therapists, and pushing people to forgive quicker than they're ready is a question that any therapist is going to say, whoa, wait a minute. Is that healthy for folks? Could these grievances resurface later if you're having them skip over? So there's an important sort of health context there. I think it's interesting that we got to talk about. There's a dilemma that religious peace practitioners face more among their hardcore believers in their communities. The pastor and the imam, for instance, are often criticized by the hardcore on their communities, hardcore Christian or hardcore Muslim sort of fundamentalist wings, preaching Chrislam, right? Some sort of syncretic is the word, syncretism, some sort of mixture or blend of the two religions, which purists on both sides say, whoa, that's heresy. You've crossed the line there by doing that. So they have to walk a very fine line by saying, no, 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 we do not preach any sort of blurring of Islam and Christianity in what we do, or blurring of Protestantism and Catholicism in Northern Ireland, etc. But it becomes a real critique that they're often faced with. In Nigeria in particular, we have to, of course, note, that these are extremely patriarchal structures. In Northern Ireland, some of the Protestant communities have gotten much better in terms of women priests and religious leaders. But let's face it, all around the world, religion tends to be more patriarchal, and there's a concern there we need to talk about. And then lastly, I just want to end by noting I need to do more comparative research. I've done a lot of work in Nigeria. I've done a little bit of work in Northern Ireland. I've done some work in the United States, but that does not mean that this is transferable to everywhere in the world. And so depending on where you are sitting in the world, you may find yourself thinking, does this work where I am in this part of the world? And I look forward to talking about that. So those are my friends, James and Ashafa, and their smiling faces in a workshop they did in Kenya. I draw great inspiration from what I've learned from them. They're inspirational people, but there are many, many people like this in communities all around the world trying to do this, and we have a lot to learn from them. So thank you so much for your time and for listening. I will stop my share, and Lillian, would you like to take it from here?
Yes, thank you so much, Darren. Thank you for this powerful and really thought-provoking talk. And really, thank you for sharing the stories of Pastor James and Imam Ashafa. I think, two people who, from what we see as opposing faiths, right, are now these role models of what peace building can look like. And I think in these times when feelings of mistrust and hatred are so strong and deep, I think these narratives and examples of forgiveness and transformation are so encouraging and powerful, and are narratives that we don't hear enough, I think, these days. And so it made me think of this like power of each of us, like that each of us have, through the examples of the both of them. And Ikeda said in one of his talks that only the efforts of individuals to achieve an inner spiritual reformation can be truly effective to change and elevate society. And I think the two of them, with the support of you and many others, I think are such great examples of this. So thank you so much, Darren.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a number of questions that came in, but just in the interest of time, we may get through 3 of them, just to give our audience, a heads up. But I will make sure we collect all the questions, and Darren, maybe we could send them to you, so at least you have them and have a sense of what everyone's thinking about. And so this first one that came in, I think, speaks very much to this current moment and maybe frustration that some of us feel of like, when are we going to achieve peace, and what does peace mean? And we sometimes, it feels like we're getting close to that moment, and then sometimes it seems like we've gone backwards. And so the question that came in is, what does the long term look like for stable peace building, and how do mediators and peace builders create structures that will outlast their individual efforts, and even survive changes in the ethnic or religious composition of a region, such as the recent changes in religious balance in Northern Ireland? So, when Pastor James and Imam Ashafa, move on or pass on, how do we sustain this work?
Yes, thank you. And I think that, yeah, the bad news is we live in a time where violence and war is only increasing around the world. So, we're at the sort of the Empire Strikes Back part of the trilogy, where our heroes are on the back foot. But I do feel like the winds are changing, and that things will be heading back in the right direction. It's going to be through the work of all of the people listening in on this call and all of the great folks doing work in the field, that's gonna shift this direction. And I agree that I think the starting place for long-term sort of peace in general is this internal climate. And I think this is partly, where my fascination with some of that final question comes from, is that certainly, and this is something I've told my students for years is that, you cannot be a good mediator or facilitator or peace builder if you are not on an internal journey yourself to try to deal with your own internal wounds, demons, and conflict issues, and the relationships in your own life. Of course, your life doesn't have to be perfect in order to be a mediator. All of us are flawed, broken individuals that are doing this kind of work. It's more so coming to a deeper understanding of those flaws and breaks within yourself, the pain that you have suffered, as we all have, and trying to learn of how to transform that into a deeper empathy and understanding of other people's pain, and a way to sort of help them understand. So that internal journey is important. And so consequently, peace building is essentially at one level, giving individuals those sorts of tools for that internal journey. And you could sum up much of what I've said in sort of this talk in terms of thinking about, in a workshop environment, how do you provide people with these kinds of internal tools so they can try to come to this internal discussion. Any of you who are Star Trek fans may remember the sort of the three-level chessboard that Kirk and Spock used to play chess on. Peace building's a little bit like that. There, you can think of it in terms of a multi-dimensional strategy. And the level we were talking about is at that bottom level. But for true peace to happen in the world, the sort of the state level and the global level also has to have the pieces arranged in a correct way. And at the state and sort of global level, like I mentioned, I mean, we're kind of losing, at those two levels. But the pieces are still moving. And I strongly encourage folks to look at Northern Ireland. And what drew me there is that, it's not nirvana, but the peace process that they accomplished there is truly amazing. And what was accomplished at all three levels, that's where I'm going with this, is that you had an effort at the global level with international mediation happening at the same time at the state level. You had state level politicians driving a peace process. You had civil society engaged in trying to put that together, and you had individuals trying to do the bridging across the divide. When you have all three of those levels lined up is when you have the best conditions for peace. And I know you're sitting there saying, well, what happens like when that isn't the case? Is that you move the pieces forward at the level that you can interact. So wherever you are able to impact this, even if it's in your own neighborhood and in your own community and in your own heart, if you're able to work on those pieces, focus on those. My research in terms of civil society and peace building shows that you don't realize the ripple effects that these smaller level initiatives can have. And that they are tremendously important in terms of building a culture of peace. That then when the politicians are ready to talk and when the global actors are ready to work it out, the bottom up energy is ready to push from there.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. And I think, here at the center, we talk a lot about how, we talk about peace at this larger scale, but even in our day-to-day interactions with strangers, with family members, that these emotions come up. And so to be able to really address those, as you shared, is really empowering to think about what we can do immediately. And I love what you said about how peace building is really about providing tools for folks to do this inner work, which kind of connects to this next question that came in. And you touched upon this in your talk and also in the response to your first to the first question. But the question is, in your experiences, how has the function of fear prevented true peace building? And I think adding on to this question, I think when I think about peace building, the difficult thing for me is that human beings are involved, and that they're, from a large to small scale. I know personally when I'm hurt in any way, how much that impacts my engagement with this person, and may result in me not talking to someone for years or the rest of my life. And so a lot of times these emotions of fear and trauma come into play. So maybe you could share some examples of how you've seen people really, like, actually, whether it's through their spiritual practices or through other tools, like really challenge these fears that prevent them from really engaging in this peace work.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, fear is the enemy of the good, so to speak, in terms of, it is the key driving factor, that prevents these sorts of engagements, and it really is why I mentioned, and I went over it briefly, but the sort of the workshop model that I've been talking about, getting people in the room itself. Once people are in the room, there's a lot you can do in terms of dealing with fears, and I'll talk about that in a second. But getting people in the room can take years
Mm.
because of fear. And so a lot of those early stages is essentially trying to build relationships so that what the peacemaker does is to be a bridge between the other side. So I fear the other side. I don't trust the other side, but I trust this peace builder in the middle who is sort of the bridge between the other side and conveys the information back and forth. And so they begin the conversation of sort of sending messages back and forth, saying, this is what's going on. And as I trust the peacemaker more, I'm willing to eventually meet that other side, trusting the peacemaker because I have confidence in them that they are going to vet that other side and make sure that the other side is not going to kill me if I show up, or isn't going to out me in some way and make my life difficult, or use this conversation in a way that works. So that kind of bridging factor is really, really important there. Within that process, a lot of the spiritual practices of the religious-based peace builder becomes essential. So you will find where the priest, the pastor, the imam, the first thing they'll do is they will pray with someone and say, Father, I'm afraid. Let's pray. Let's meditate together. Um, a lot of religious-based peace practitioners, engage in a host of different rituals. Rituals can be extremely calming, and rituals could include song, right? Hymns, singing, dancing. The culture will have a lot to say about this, right? In terms of things that make people comfortable. Let's engage them. The arts can be a fabulous tool in terms of building up confidence in each side. The storytelling dimension that I mentioned earlier is a really important part of this for trying to break down fears. When one side actually hears the other side tell their story, and they see that that person is a person who has suffered like I have suffered. And we, as facilitators, we make sure that people tell their personal stories. You don't tell the story of your group because that's always incendiary, right? Because that gets into your group did this to us. No, we didn't. You did it first, so that you don't get into that dynamic. You talk about this is my life story, and I lost a loved one in an attack, and it destroyed my life. And then you tell your story and you say, I lost a loved one too, and I've been struggling with it ever since. That kind of storytelling where we talk about, how we've suffered, builds confidence and helps to circumvent fear.
Mm. Yeah, that reminds me, Darren, you know, Ikeda often talked about how, he was able to engage in dialogue with people from different religious traditions and different countries and different backgrounds because they shared this experience of suffering. And because they both experienced suffering, we can communicate with anyone. So I appreciate that, like sort of creating value from our suffering. And I had sort of a follow-up question for you quickly before we go into our last one. I appreciated you talking about the role of the facilitator, and in your role as the facilitator over the many, years of your work. What are some spiritual practices or tools that you've used? I imagine the role of the facilitator is so important, right? So you go into these spaces and you're holding space for all these different emotions and the fears and the trauma. And so you have to sort of be that person to hold space for both, right? And to build that trust in a room where mistrust is like rampant. And so how have you sort of developed yourself how have you done your inner work over the decades of your work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a journey that's never finished until you yourself have left this life, right?
Mm.
We are all on the, what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey, right? Where we are all on that path, trying to continue to constantly sort of self-improve and evolve as human beings, and through the spiritual lens, bringing us closer, back to the light, so to speak. And so for me, I try to meditate daily. I've more so, tried to embrace the experiences that I have had. Like anyone, I've had pain in my life, and it's a very powerful teacher. And in some ways, when I would talk to people that had been in communities that suffered these terrible bloodlettings, as a younger person, I didn't have a direct experience of that. And so it didn't prevent me from being helpful. But the more that I experienced life, and I experienced losses and suffering on my own, the more it made me able to understand other people's suffering. And it's interesting, there's something in a person's eyes and in their demeanor that you recognize pain in somebody else. You recognize, and not only simply the pain, but you recognize somebody who's tried to walk the walk. And it's just something about the way they talk about things, or just the way they listen to you and understand. Understanding when you see it. you know
Mm,
and it doesn't mean that I've had members of my village killed, like some of the folks I've spoken with and heard with and tried to work with and so on. But I've had losses that felt terrible in a different way. And that fear of losing a loved one and so on. It's hard, for instance, to be a parent and not have the mortal fear of something could happen to your kid. So all of those things, the more that you try to process those and grow those, the better. But at the same time, also, to recognize the limits of that is that, there are some things in your experience I can never truly understand because I haven't walked your path.
mm,
But I can empathize and I can appreciate it. And I think that kind of humility and respect, that a reflective lifestyle, is very, very important for all of us. So to all of you out there, keep on your path. Keep that inner exploration going. And whatever religion you belong to, whatever spirituality you belong to, if you're not religious or spiritual, whatever moves you, if it is nature, music, art, whatever it is that moves you, embrace it, follow it, and keep have it keep deepening you as much as you can, and it will make you a better peace builder in whatever context that you are in.
mm. Thank you, Darren. And this pain is a very powerful teacher. I really love that. I wrote that down. And I love that you bring your whole self into the peace building work, right? It's not separate from our experiences. And so I think all of us can really think about that as we leave tonight. So this last question, I know we're a little over time, so I apologize to our attendees, but I think this one is maybe very relevant to the US and just sort of how we talk about religion in this country. So this came from a recent graduate of the ed school, and he wanted to know, how can we as teachers really promote religious-based practices in the classroom to promote peace? So we can conclude with this question.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I mean, and I think a really tricky question, right? Depending on what country you are in, the rules and regulations for what a teacher can present in terms of religion may be restricted. So understanding whatever, keeping in mind whatever those parameters are, first of all, in your classroom. Maybe you're not in a country where it's restricted, but maybe you're in a school where, it's not allowed. For whatever reason, or only one particular tradition is allowed, etc. I think being knowing what those parameters are is a starting place, but within those parameters, I think the more that you can talk about the internal reflection dimension, I think is a really good starting place. You don't have to call it religion, Sometimes we use the word, value-based, right? Thinking about values. Sometimes you can use the word ethics, right? If you talk about sort of the internal journey, sometimes you can use the word spirituality. You've heard already the way I framed it in terms of my last comments. I think, that framing it in a way within whatever context you are in that people can hear, that provokes, that says something to the effect of thinking about your reflective practice. And reflective practice doesn't have to be religious. It doesn't have to be spiritual. It is simply, thinking about, where you are coming from. So there are lots of different words out there in the field that you can use for that. And so frame it the way that makes sense for you. Reflection is a good one we often use. Talking about norms, is another way you can think about it. A normative conversation. What are the values, that are present? But peace generally is a fairly, global term you can get away with. Even if peace is too polarized in that context, you can think in terms of coexistence as a word. But finding the language that works, and finding some kind of sort of, I think step one is thinking about a sort of a reflective practice. What's some kind of reflective tool that you can use in that? Second is thinking about conversation parameters. What's the language that you can use for talking about norms, ethics, values? And then third, trying to find some kind of practice that allows your students to engage in an interactive exercise. Simulations are often a useful tool in this regard. Rituals can be helpful depending on the context that you're in. Whatever, sort of allows the conversation to happen. Those three buckets, I think, are sort of useful ways I've seen teachers try to broach these conversations. Maybe a fourth bucket is to have a conversation with leadership itself. Talk with principals, talk with school administrators, talk with parents, depending on what level of education you're working with. If you're at the graduate or undergraduate level, then talking with students themselves, student organizations, and sort of working with gatekeepers in your context to try to take them on this journey first. You remember the imam, the pastor worked with the imams and the pastors first before going to the communities. Who are your imam and pastors, so to speak, in your community? Who are your gatekeepers that you need to convince? Maybe run some sessions with them, convert them into champions, and then they will help open those doors.
Mm. Thank you, Darren. I really appreciate these alternative ways to engage with this work, and that dialogue is really central, right, to everything. And I also hope that, through hearing your talk and your presentation, that, we can create more spaces for folks to talk about and unpack religion and what that means. And I was listening to a podcast with you recently, and the interviewer asked you if religion, peace building with a language, what is a word that you would like to hear more of? And you said spirituality. And I thought that's, such a powerful thing to think about in this moment. And I hope we can continue to bring that into the peace building space. So thank you again, Darren, for your really sharing your wisdom and your vast amount of experiences with us today. And thank you to our audience for your thoughtful questions. And so, now at this point, at the Ikeda Center, we often like to end with a reflection or takeaway activity so that we can process what we learned and really decide what action we're going to take from now. And so for the next couple minutes before we conclude, we'd like to invite everyone to share takeaways from Darren's talk and perhaps how you'd like to apply it in your own life. So you'll see the screen in front of you with a link. So you can go to menti.com and you can put in this code 5775-4533. And you can you will then be invited to submit your takeaway, and I'll read some of your responses as they come in.
Lillian, I could put my email in the chat box too. Would that be helpful?
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Okay, great.
Great. So we'll just give maybe a couple seconds for responses to come in. The power of storytelling. I think we I'm pretty sure it was Donna Hicks, Darren, but Donna visited us recently. And I can't remember if she was quoting someone, but we talked about how, facts don't convince people, but stories do. And so I really appreciated your emphasis on storytelling tonight. Continue doing the hard inner work. Yes. The willingness to change yourself first and foremost as you are asking others to evolve as well. Strategies to teach peace. Continue on the spiritual inner work and journey. Forgiveness is key. Yeah, on another talk, Darren, I'd love to unpack this idea of forgiveness more, because I think that's, the most difficult thing, but I hadn't really thought about how our religious and faith traditions can really help us do that work of forgiving. But I think that is the biggest obstacle, at least in my mind. So yes, dialogue, reflection, inner work, and more dialogue, that it's important to do the inner work in order to make a change. If you have war inside you, how can you create it externally? Importance of internal reflection. So maybe we'll have one more, and then, yeah, please continue to post your responses here, and we will compile them and send them out in our write-up even after this talk. So with that, thank you again for these wonderful reflections. And I'd like to now turn it over to our Executive Director, Kevin Marr, to share some remarks to close out our event tonight.
Thank you so much, Lillian, and good evening, everyone. So as we draw this inspiring evening to a close, I want to first extend a deep appreciation to Dr. Darren Kew for his really insightful, fascinating, and hope-filled talk on religion and peace building. I really felt Dr. Kew's reflections highlight how religious peacemakers, drawing on their own spiritual frameworks and sacred texts, possess unique tools that enable them to build trust, overcome divisions, and promote reconciliation within their communities. I was particularly struck by Dr. Kew's experiences in Nigeria and Northern Ireland, and by the powerful way that storytelling and shared dialogue among leaders of different religious traditions can lead to transformative peace building. That was my takeaway. I put in the Mentimeter. So in a time when polarization and conflict are really shaking the foundations of our global community, the role of these peace builders cannot be overstated. And as Dr. Kew reminds us, religion can serve as a wellspring of forgiveness, healing, and resilience. And rooted in personal transformation, it has a capacity to inspire individuals and communities to build bridges where walls have long stood. And this vision aligns perfectly with the life work and philosophy of Daisaku Ikeda, and in particular, his vision of human revolution, which namely the inner transformation of an individual as a catalyst for broader societal change, resonates deeply with the unique strengths of religious peacemakers. Mr. Ikeda's belief that lasting peace begins with the interchange of each person mirrors how such peacemakers guide individuals toward personal growth as a foundation for collective healing. And by encouraging self-reflection, compassion, and dialogue rooted in shared values, Mr. Ikeda's vision reinforces the powerful role religion can play in transforming conflict into coexistence. And this vision closely aligns with the philosophy of Mr. Ikeda. And in a speech given at the University of Havana in 1996 titled "Building a Great Spiritual Bridge to the New Century," Mr. Ikeda emphasized that, quote, "The transformation in the inner awareness or state of life of an individual is intrinsically connected to the flowering of the poetic spirit. An expansion in this inner realm of life encourages empathy for others and strengthens the desire to contribute to society. It brings forth the sun of wisdom and compassion from within the depths of one's life. And the light of this sun is that of respect for human dignity and the sanctity of all life, and it can be tapped equally by all. And the process of human revolution, bringing forth this inner sun, is the motive force that can enhance solidarity among people, lead to the prosperity of society, and create peace for humankind." And to me, this passage highlights a key connection between personal transformation and the collective well-being of society. It suggests that as individuals awaken to a deeper inner awareness, or the flowering of the poetic spirit, as Mr. Ikeda calls, that they naturally become more empathetic, compassionate, and committed to the greater good, as Dr. Kew really highlighted tonight. And I feel that the metaphor of the inner sun underscores the universal potential within each person to illuminate the world around them. And that by nurturing this inner light, we not only elevate our own lives, but also help build a more peaceful and harmonious society. And this belief aligns with one of the center's core convictions that fostering inner transformation is a critical foundation for creating cultures of peace. And tonight's talk reminded us that this transformation is both possible as well as urgent. And so to each of you that joined us tonight, thank you so much for being here, especially those joining us late in the evening, early in the morning. We're grateful that you are able to participate tonight. And we're so thankful to receive so many thoughtful reflections and questions in the chat throughout the event. We only got to a small portion, but there were many that were shared throughout the night. And as Lillian mentioned in her opening remarks, Indigo Talks is our sole virtual event. And since its launch in 2021, it has brought together hundreds of participants from countries in various parts of the world, all united by a shared commitment to exploring pathways to fostering peace. And that your presence here tonight is a powerful reminder of the enduring hope that we each hold. Through deep listening, meaningful dialogue, and shared reflection, we can work together to shape a more peaceful world. So, Dr. Kew, again, thank you once again for your wisdom and insights tonight. It's been a great joy for us to reconnect in planning this event. And tonight, you have helped illuminate a path forward, one that is clear about the challenges that we face and grounded in the real potential of religious communities to foster peace. So to conclude, in his message to our center on the occasion of our 20th anniversary, Mr. Ikeda writes that, quote, "Whatever country we hail from or interests we represent, in the end, we are all human. We are comrades together, confronting the universal human experiences of birth, aging, sickness, and death. Our lives are like precious gems, bearing within them an indomitable force for good. We were all born of mothers whose deepest desire is for peace. When we unclench hearts closed like fists and listen and speak with honesty and integrity, we can discover the shared resonance of our souls. When we open ourselves to learn from our differences, we experience life with new richness and depth. Dialogue is the key to creating value for peace and harmonious coexistence." So thank you again so much for joining us tonight, and have a great night. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin, to you and to Lillian for this wonderful opportunity and for those kind words, and to all of you for joining. Thanks again so much.
Thank you, Darren.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. And we will be sending a recording out. And so please stay tuned for that, as well as a write-up. And so thank you again, and we'll see you next year at our Indigo Talk.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.